Welcome back everybody to the continuous coverage of the FIDE World Cup, one of the most fun and exciting events of the year. 256 players are coming from all over the world to compete for, of course, the coveted title, but also for the 2 tickets to the Candidates Tournament. The finalists of the World Cup are going to be sent to the Candidates Tournament. Of course, the Candidates Tournament is the tournament that determines who the challenger for the World Championship match is going to be. This World Cup belongs to the 2022 World Championship cycle, not the one that is going to end this year in the match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen. Needless to say, this tournament is a big deal. It's such a big deal that also the world champion is participating in it. He was offered a wild card by the International Chess Federation. He accepted. This is a good opportunity for him to prepare for the World Championship match, which is going to happen in October. There's not as many classical tournaments, and this one is probably the most competitive and the strongest events of them all. Also, it's a very long event, so it allows the world champion, if he manages to make it all the way until the finals, to test his stamina, which is going to be extremely important during the World Championship match. In this round, he is playing against Martinovic Sasa, and this is the first game that the world champion is going to play in this year's World Cup. Round number 2, Martinovic Sasa with the white pieces, Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces. Let's see what happens. Let's go. d4, knight to f6, c4, g6. Once again, Magnus Carlsen is with the black pieces, knight to c3, d5. We get the Grunfeld from the world champion. We've seen this from him in the World Championship match against Viswanathan Anand as well. So definitely he has a lot of experience. C takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop to d2. That's a very interesting approach with the bishop on d2, defending this knight on c3, preparing the move e4. And whenever black is going to capture on c3, which is the usual response whenever white attacks the knight with e4, white is just simply going to take back with the bishop and challenge the Grunfeld bishop on g7 on the long diagonal. That's generally the plan. Let's see what happens. c5, Magnus immediately attacks the center, rook to c1, knight to c6, d takes c5, Sasa Martinovic finally accepts the gift, bishop to g7, e4, knight to b4, of course taking advantage of the fact that after e4 some squares have weakened, specifically this square d3, knight to f3, castle, a3, knight to d3 check. a3 was meant at kicking this knight away, but also at potentially tying these 3 pawns together and creating this pawn chain, very important pawn chain, because you want to defend your extra pawn on c5. Knight to d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. Now, of course, white would love to castle. Unfortunately, that's not allowed because that queen is protecting against that. So you have to cut this action of the queen with the move queen to e2, inviting the endgame. Let's see whether Magnus accepted the invitation. He did indeed accept the invitation for a simple fact. One of the most important advantages for black in this position is the fact that white doesn't have a light square bishop. What that means, it means that this bishop is not going to have any opponent and is going to be able to roam around and create a lot of problems for the white king. Despite the fact that we have an endgame, the king is still quite weak in the center. Of course, white cannot take back with the knight because this pawn on b2 would hang. So you have to take with the king, and now immediately Magnus Carlsen launches the attack against the king on e2 with bishop to e6, getting ready to go to c4. Knight to d5, stopping this bishop from going to c4. Bishop takes b2. Unfortunately for him, this also allows black to recapture his lost pawn. Remember, white had an extra pawn on c5, not anymore. This pawn on b2 has been lost. Rook to c2. Now this is already a mistake, and that is because Sasa Martinovic thought that after bishop takes a3, which happened in the game, black will lose a piece, but that is not the case. Much better in this position after bishop to b2 would have been for Sasha to just simply go rook to b1, create this attack on the b file, and after a move such as bishop takes a3, I'm going to recapture my pawn on b7. But much more importantly, I'm also going to activate my pieces. And in this endgame, this is what it's all about. Activation and finding that activity for your pieces. For example, of course, you can still take this pawn on c5, but after rook to c1, you're going to have some interesting problems to solve because you have these two pieces on the c file. You do have moves such as knight to d8 to defend, but after rook to c7 or knight to e7, white's position is more or less okay. Instead of that, after bishop to b2, Sasha decided to go rook to c2. This allows black to take on a3, but Sasha was very happy with this because he thought at this point, almost 100%, he thought that he caught black's bishop with the move rook to a1. Where is this bishop going? Well, he's not going to go to c5. That pawn is protected by the rook. He's not going to go to b4. That square is protected heavily by the knight on d5 and the bishop on d2. You cannot take on d5 to relieve this pressure on the square b4 and say that, okay, now I can play the move bishop to b4 because you don't no longer have the knight on d5 controlling that square. Well, I do not have the knight controlling that square, but I do have this pawn to capture the knight. So that's not an option as well. At this point, it doesn't seem like conventionally black can save his piece. But what did Sasa Martinovic miss? Well, if you want to find out for yourself, if you want to test yourself, stop the video right now and come back 30 seconds later, maybe a minute later. Well, I hope you did just that because the next move is explosive. f5, leaving this bishop on pre. You're going to be invited actually to take the bishop on a3. The problem is, once you take this bishop, I can just simply take on e4. And this is what happened in the game. Now you have two knights under attack. This bishop is beautifully attacking the knight on d5. This pawn is attacking the knight on f3. Unfortunately, this is a very difficult dilemma to answer for white. You're just simply going to have to give me one of your knights back. Knight takes e7 was Sasa Martinovic's choice. Knight takes e7, knight to d4, bishop to d7. The problem is right now, after all these exchanges, black is just simply a pawn up. And we know Magnus Carlsen, when it comes to positional conversions, whenever you give him a little bit of an advantage, he's going to capitalize on it, he's going to convert it, he's going to torture you all the way until you cry for mommy. Rook to b2, knight to c6, bishop to e3, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. Now we get opposite color bishops, but unfortunately for white, there are also rooks on the board. So that means the king on e2 is going to become a weakness. Let's see how that happened. Bishop to c6. Now black's plan is very simple. He's going to try to double up on the d file and try to invade via the d file. Rook to a2, a6. Of course, I'm going to put my pawns on the light squares. These pawns are simply untouchable. The bishop on c6 is protecting absolutely everything. Not only that is protecting everything, but also is ready to attack the king via the square b5. King to e3, rook to d8, rook to d2, rook to d5, preparing the doubling of the rooks on d file as I was mentioning. King to e2, rook to d8, bishop to e3, rook to d3, a classy move by the world champion, typical Magnus Carlsen move, making it more uncomfortable for his opponent. This rook on d3, this thorn in white's position, is not going to be able to be taken because after rook takes d3, e takes d3, rook takes d3, well, I'm going to go bishop to b5. That's going to pin the rook on d3. The rook is not going to be able to move and is going to be lost in the next move. Pin it to win it. The game is over. Instead of rook takes d3, of course, white decided to keep the rook on the board with the move rook to a1, king to f7. This is what you should be doing in the endgame when you have the opportunity to bring the king towards the center, activate the king. This is precisely what you should be looking for. Do not hurry with the conversion phase of the game. You want to maximize the potential of all your pieces, and this is what Magnus Carlsen is good at, among many other things. King to f7, g3, rook takes d2, bishop takes d2, bishop to b5, and now this spells trouble for white because you would love to be able to activate the king and go king to e3. The problem is, after rook to d3, well, you can sign the score sheets and go home because the game is over. You can go king to e2, but after rook to a3, that's a check, discovery check, you're losing the rook on a1, the game is over. And if you don't want to go into the discovery check, well, sure, you can take the pawn on e4, but the bishop on d2 is unprotected and the game is over. So white cannot go forward with the king, has to go backwards. King to e1 was played, rook to d3, rook to b1, king to e6, rook to b4, bishop to c6, rook to b2, king to e5, and at this point Sasa Martinovic was like, okay, I've had enough, it's time to go home and try to prepare for the next round because the position is pretty much over. There is no way to stop the penetration of this king to c4, and then that's just going to pick up this pawn, but also prepare to push the pawns on the queen side and promote. If you try to defend with the move bishop to e3, well, that's a problem because, okay, this bishop on e3 is nicely protecting the pawn c5 and the entry square on d4. But what it doesn't protect anymore is this pawn on a6 from pushing. So I'm just simply going to go a5, a4, a3, a2, and that's just going to win the game. So unfortunately for Sasa Martinovic, after king to e5, he decided that enough is enough. Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, starts the World Cup with a victory in game 1 of round number 2, and tomorrow he's going to play the white side. A draw in that game is going to clinch the match and is going to allow him to advance to round number 3. What's going to happen tomorrow? Only time will tell.